Greetings, and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Collaboration Mailbox Types. So we all understand what a typical mailbox is all about, and we've also explored some of the other recipient types that you can create with Exchange, but in this lesson we're going to focus on collaboration mailboxes. Exchange is more than a tool for communication, but it's also one that assists with collaboration. As a result, we see a variety of different mailbox types that we can implement, including site mailboxes, public folders. Now you might say, well, that's not actually a mailbox type, but it is now part of the mailbox database, and so it's been changed and modernized with the Exchange 2013 implementation of public folders. So we're going to talk about it in this context. And there are also shared mailboxes, which all three together, these are essential to aid your organization toward greater levels of collaboration. Okay, so let's get started. So to start with, we have site mailboxes, which require Exchange 2013 for the email portion and SharePoint 2013 for the document storage portion. So under the covers of a site mailbox, the content is kept where it belongs. Exchange will store the email, providing users with that same message view for email conversations that they use every day for their own mailboxes, so it provides for a familiar interface for working with that email and those documents. Meanwhile, SharePoint will store the documents, and that brings into play some of the SharePoint features that we love, like document co-authoring and versioning. All of that gets brought to the table. Now, of course, this requires that we bring SharePoint 2013 into the mix in our organizations. And so some organizations simply won't be doing that, and so they won't be able to take advantage of site mailboxes. Now, what happens on the Exchange side is Exchange will synchronize just enough metadata from SharePoint in order to create a document view in Outlook. So that includes things in the metadata like document title, last modified date, last modified author, the size, and so forth. Keep in mind that site mailboxes can only be used by end users who are working with either Outlook 2013 or perhaps accessing documents through their browser through SharePoint 2013. Essentially, the emails and the documents, although kept in separate storage locations, are accessible through the same client interface. A site mailbox has SharePoint 2013 site membership, that's owners and members. It includes shared storage through Exchange and SharePoint, and end-user clients using Outlook 2013 or, as we said, SharePoint 2013. However, it's good to note that Outlook Web App does not support site mailbox access. The promise of site mailboxes is that they'll be a much better collaboration tool than public folders in many ways. However, their Achilles heel is the requirement that we have now to deploy additional software with SharePoint 2013 and a brand new client with Outlook 2013. So that's the negative side. However, as far as the client is concerned, if you are deploying Exchange 2013 in your environment, then hopefully you've already made the decision to go with Outlook 2013 so that the two match up. So with Exchange 2013, you'll get a more robust experience for your end users if they're using the latest client. That doesn't mean you have to deploy the entire Office 2013 suite, just the Outlook client. So that is listed as one of the negatives, that you would have to go with this new Outlook 2013 client, but most likely you were going to do that anyway. But SharePoint 2013 may not be something that your organization was interested in pursuing. So in that case, you're really not going to be able to set up site mailboxes, especially seeing as how the site mailbox is set up through the SharePoint 2013 side. So it will be interesting to see how site mailboxes are deployed, how they're used in production environments, and whether, after some time passes, if really organizations appreciate what site mailboxes can give them, and really if they live up to the hype and the promised advantages that Microsoft is promoting. Now in our case with SpyTech Prime, our fictitious organization that we're working with, we're not going to set up a SharePoint 2013 server in order to demonstrate the use and the value of site mailboxes. Rather, we're going to stay focused on what Exchange offers out of the box without having to deploy SharePoint or Lync or any other solution to make it work better. So in addition to site mailboxes, as we already mentioned, we have shared mailboxes and we have public folders. So let's talk a little bit about shared mailboxes. Now, in an earlier lesson, we talked about shared mailboxes when we were discussing recipient types. And again, these are mailboxes that allow multiple users to open, read, and send emails from or to. So shared mailboxes are a type of user mailbox, a recipient type. And what typically happens with a shared mailbox is users sign into their own mailboxes, and then they open the shared mailbox by adding the shared mailbox to their Outlook profile if they have permissions through the Send As or Full Access permission settings. In legacy versions of Exchange, starting with Exchange 2003 and earlier, shared mailboxes were really just regular mailboxes to which an administrator could grant access. Beginning in Exchange 2007, however, shared mailboxes became their own recipient type. But when you wanted to create a shared mailbox, it was a multi-step process where you had to use the Exchange Management shell, and you'd have to complete some of the tasks through the shell. In Exchange 2013, however, creating a shared mailbox is a single-step process using the Exchange Administration Center. Having a common mailbox, it's great. It's great for sales, support, information type needs for a generic email, so something like sales@spytechprime.com. So there are a variety of different benefits to having a shared mailbox. Here we see the three primary benefits to a shared mailbox. First of all, having a generic email account. Second, departments can provide centralized services. And third, multiple users can monitor and reply to that generic email. And the value there as well is that sometimes those types of workers can be transient, so they may be temp workers, they may be individuals that assist for a time in, let's say, the sales department and move on to either other organizations or to other things. And so when you have a mailbox that utilizes a generic email account, it's good to have multiple users that can care for it, but then they can move on to other departments or to other organizations, and it doesn't change the email that's utilized for persons to be able to get in touch with your company, whether it's sales or information or departments within your organization. So it makes it much easier to do all of that through a shared mailbox. Let's jump back over to our Exchange server, and even though we've taken a look at this before when we were discussing recipient types, let's take a quick look again at how we would create a shared mailbox within our Exchange Administration Center. And as you can see, we're on our Windows Server 2012, and we're already logged into the Exchange Admin Center. One thing you might notice is that there's been a little bit of a change to the look here, and it's just a little thing, but I wanted to change the font so that I would be able to appreciate the look of this a little better. So you might wonder, well, how do I do that? If you just go up to the little settings pinwheel here, and you go to Internet Options, right here under the Fonts button, under Appearance for the General tab, that's where you can change it. I changed it to Arial because I thought it would be a little bit better. I can't remember if it was Times New Roman or what awkward font they were using there, but so this looks a little bit more pleasing to my eyes at least, and so I can work with this a little bit better. From here, we're under the Recipients feature. We see the tabs. Here's the Shared tab again. And if you recall, in an earlier lesson, we did create a shared mailbox called Sales. So here we can open that up. Creating the mailbox itself is easy, actually, but then once it's created, you can go in and you can put in more information. Here you can see Mailbox Delegation. Currently, this mailbox is given full access to David Walker, who's the head of sales. No Send As permission just yet. And here you can see Last Logon. You can provide various quota settings here for the mailbox. You can establish retention settings for the mailbox, contact information, organization information, the email address for that mailbox, which when we set it up, it was info@spytechprime.com. Here we have mailbox features. You can establish policy settings for the mailbox, what distribution groups the mailbox is part of, and then you can configure a mail tip. So it has really all of the same settings that you would have for a regular mailbox, but it's this shared mailbox, so the delegation part is unique. And just to reenact what we did earlier to create that mailbox, we just click the little plus sign, we put in a name, we choose an organizational unit if it applies, we give it an email address. It has to be a unique email address. It shouldn't exist elsewhere in the organization. And then you can provide here full access or Send As information. And then here there are more options for alias and so forth. But ultimately, From this point, you can create the new shared mailbox and then go in later, and as you saw, configure additional information. Okay, so at this point, let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk about another type of collaboration mailbox, and that is a public folder mailbox. All right, so let's talk about public folders. These have been used for years as a collaboration tool within Exchange. They've also been used as a dumping ground for data. So if you're an Exchange administrator that has worked with Exchange for years, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. You know that typically these public folders get set up, people start dumping data into it, they start posting to it, that data gets old, but it stays there and it just becomes this place for data to be dumped. It's a pet peeve of many Exchange administrators, but it is what it is. And so now we have SharePoint, and so this has been termed the new public folder dumping ground. So ultimately, if you're looking at shared collaborative storage locations like public folders or SharePoint document libraries, you're looking at a situation where at times data is dumped, it's forgotten about, and years later you have to clean it up. So that's what public folders have been known for. And so data is set up with an easy to view and search hierarchy with branches that can be expanded. And so most folks that have worked for organizations of different sizes, they're pretty well aware of how public folders work from an end user perspective. Some have the ability to create public folders of their own, but typically the administrator will set up the top level parts to the branch, and then they'll delegate the responsibility to others to manage the creation of additional public folders. And there's all of these different permission settings and so forth. And so public folders have been around for quite a long time. In fact, there was talk of getting rid of public folders at some point in the future, and we'll see if that actually takes place. But in the meantime, we still have public folders. They have been modernized, however. So public folders, what's interesting about them, here we were talking about site mailboxes, but with public folders and collaboration, we don't require SharePoint 2013 to allow for this collaboration and document sharing. And so public folders can be accessed by Outlook 2007, 2010, 2013, and so it doesn't require SharePoint and it doesn't require a specialized version of Outlook either. Now Exchange 2013 does change the game a bit with public folders, in that public folders used to require a public folder database. And so with Exchange 2013, you do not create a public folder database. However, you do need to create a public folder mailbox. And then within the public folder mailbox, you create your public folders that will contain the actual content. Now, the way this is a game changer is that with public folder databases, you would establish public folder databases on multiple Exchange mailbox servers, perhaps around your organization, which could be around the world. And then you would decide which public folders you wanted to have replicas of, and so the hierarchy would be displayed to end users. But if you wanted to put that data closer to end users that might need it, you would create replicas in other parts of your organization, perhaps even around the world. Well, that's different now with Exchange public folder mailboxes in 2013. And so in this case, there's only one location for that mailbox, in much the same way that there's only one location for a typical recipient mailbox. And so that data then sits on that server in that mailbox. And so when an individual around the world tries to access that data, they're not going to a local copy perhaps, but they're going wherever that data is located. So if they're looking for something within a public folder mailbox, within a public folder, and they're looking at content, wherever the active copy of that public folder mailbox is located, that's where they're going to have to go in order to get the data. So that is a change. It is a change in terms of the replica copies that we used to see in the past. These are modernized public folders, they're calling them, and ultimately it will require that an individual perhaps in Australia is accessing data in a public folder that might be in France. And of course that all depends on whether or not you have offices in France or Australia. But hopefully you get the point, that there is a change, there's been a change to the architecture of public folders, and so as a result, on the one hand, we have a simplification, it's easier. There's also the value of having a public folder mailbox be a part of a regular mailbox database, in that now that database is part of a high availability structure, so you can use database availability groups, and that will protect the data in the public folders. So that actually provides an extra piece that we didn't have before with public folders and public folder databases. So there's a little bit of give and take in this change in the architecture. Now, after you create this first public folder mailbox, that mailbox contains the master hierarchy information, and so that's just part of the process. But now, another thing you can do with public folder mailboxes is you can mail enable public folders so that emails can be sent directly to it. You can also establish quotas. So a lot of the flexibility is still there with public folders. It's true that it's changed architecturally, and there are some negative sides to this in that you can't bring those public folders closer to people like we could before with replicas. But there's positives to it as well in that now you can establish it as part of a DAG, a database availability group. And the flexibility is still there to mail enable and also establish quotas on public folders. Alright, so we've talked enough about this. Now let's actually see it in action. Let's take a look first at our scenario and see what we're going to do here as part of our scenario, and then we'll jump over to the server and we'll start working with public folders. So as part of our scenario with our fictitious company Spytech Prime, the first thing we're going to do is create a new public folder mailbox. So that's the first thing we need to do if we're going to create public folders in that mailbox. We're going to add that public folder mailbox to our typical database for all of our other recipients within Spytech Prime. So it's not going to go in a separate database. As mentioned, that's no longer necessary. It's just going to go right into the database that we use for our recipient mailboxes. And then we'll create 3 public folders based on locations. So we'll include a Trinidad, a Miami, and a London location for the 3 public folders. At the same time, we'll mail enable the Trinidad public folder. And during the process, we'll also take a look at all of the different settings so that you can see what other things we could do with these modernized public folders, or modern public folders as they call it. Alright, so let's jump over to our server and let's get started on this. Alright, so even though the public folder mailbox is a mailbox, we won't find it under recipients. It's actually given its own feature under public folders, and we can see here we have no public folder mailbox yet. So the first thing we need to do is create a public folder mailbox. Note it says every public folder must be contained in a public folder mailbox. Okay, so we click the plus sign. We can call it public folder 1. And we can put it in an organizational unit or let it just go right to the user's container. The mailbox database, in our case, we can narrow it down to mailbox database 2 and click save. And that's pretty much it. But note that it contains the primary hierarchy because it's the first one that we created. Now, if we open this up, notice, and it's something to keep in mind whenever you're working with Exchange, that when you create something it looks pretty simple, but it's always good to open it up afterwards to see if there are additional configuration options that perhaps they don't show you when you're creating it initially. And so that's for your benefit. It's to avoid the clutter that you might not need to have in front of you when you're just looking to get things started and just create public folders or recipients or whatever it is. So here we see that now that we've created the public folder 1 public folder mailbox, we can look at the name, we can change that. Here's the organizational unit it was put in. It's really not in an organizational unit. It's in a container called users, and we see the database. We can go to mailbox usage. At this point, no one's logged in, so we don't see any usage, but we can establish quotas, and we can make it so that there's a quota on the public folder mailbox itself to ensure that the public folder mailbox doesn't grow beyond a certain point. At this point, we're going to leave things alone. Now, one of the reasons why we might want to get involved with this is because right now it will use the default quota settings from the mailbox database. So if you created a separate public folder database that you then put this public folder mailbox into, and you establish the quota settings at the database level that you are comfortable for this public folder mailbox, well then that would be fine. But at this point, it's actually going to be limited to the same settings for an individual mailbox. So that may not be what you want. And if you are doing some kind of a migration from a legacy version of Exchange, if you are migrating public folders, you may need more room than what you would give an ordinary individual for a quota. So at that point, you would want to customize the settings. You might want to make this unlimited until you see where you're at in terms of the size. and then you can always come back and adjust this later. So just a few pointers as far as the practical implementation of public folder mailboxes. Again, this is all new, the architecture is new, and the use of these will be different and unique. So it may just take some getting used to as far as how to work with these within an environment, especially if you're migrating over from a legacy version. So now that we have our public folder mailbox, we can go over to public folders, and we don't have any currently, so we're going to click the plus sign. Remember, the first one we're going to create is Trinidad. We're going to create Miami. And we're going to create London. Okay, so now we look at this and we can see a few settings right here on the right hand side. This shows us details, but much like the actions pane that we used to have with the Exchange Management Console, we can still provide some management right here through the links. So the folders are not mail enabled, so you can see that right here. We want to mail enable Trinidad, so we can do that. We can actually click Enable. And now that public folder has been enabled. You can see the mailbox that it's in, the public folder 1, and we see that there are no subfolders to any of these. That's because we haven't created them yet. So at this point, if we go in and look at the folder itself, here's where we would create subfolders, and we can create these subfolders just giving them names. And then once you have subfolders, you would want to establish permissions on those subfolders. You click the up arrow to go back. Notice we can manage folder permissions from here. So here, add or remove users who can access this public folder and edit their permissions. So we can click the plus sign, and here these are all of the permissions that we're used to seeing when it comes to public folders. So this may take some getting used to if you've never worked with public folders before. Oftentimes what you do is, as an administrator, you establish the top level public folders. And then what you do is you delegate to others, responsible individuals who are trusted, to really handle the rest of the management of public folders. Because the last thing you want as an Exchange administrator is to be sucked into the world of public folder management. This can get out of hand very quickly. So oftentimes you establish who's going to have the various permissions, and note that by selecting a different permission level, it changes the actual permissions for the individuals. So we would browse and select a person, let's say for reviewer permissions. That would only allow them to read items and see the folder, as opposed to a contributor, which allows you to create items, as opposed to a non-editing author. You can see here you get a little bit more. An author still cannot create subfolders. An editor still cannot create subfolders. A publishing author can create subfolders. So you see the difference there. A publishing editor has almost all of the permissions, and then owner has everything. So you can see how you can customize this if you want, or you can use the standard permission levels. And it's good to know what these are, but you can't memorize them, and you shouldn't unless you're going to take the Microsoft certification exam, and perhaps that's a question you're concerned about. But for the most part, it's just good to know that you have these permission levels and how to configure them. So in this case, with our folders here, we see this is London, and so let's just say we're going to create an owner for the London public folder, and let's say we're going to give it to Donna. She's responsible for the London branch of SpyTech Prime. We click Save, and so there you can see she has permissions there. Now at that point, she can actually utilize Outlook to create additional public folders, subfolders, right within that public folder. So we don't have to do any more here. We don't have to go in and create those subfolders. In certain circumstances, it might be required that we do go in and create additional subfolders. So it just depends on your environment, your organization, how far into the hierarchy you have to create the public folder structure. Perhaps you're recreating a public folder structure that you plan on migrating over. So as you can see, there's a lot to think about here. But you can see how easy it is to work with all of this. And so the goal is to manage these, get them set up, and then move them off, delegate them to someone else to work with. So in our case, we've completed our assignment for SpyTech Prime. We created the various folders. The smart thing to do would be to go in and to manage the folder permissions for each one of these and then delegate it off to someone else. And then if they needed some of these to be mail enabled, we can do that as well. You saw how easy it was. You just select, click enable, and it's ready to go. Now individuals within the organization can use an email address to actually send information into that public folder. So before we conclude this lesson, let's jump over to a Windows 8 client and let's take a look at the public folder structure from the account of Donna O'Grady, because we just assigned her as the owner of the London public folder. And let's take a look at how Donna would be able to work with the public folder structure from within that Outlook client. Okay, and so here we are logged in as Donna. Let's open up her Outlook 2013. And we can see here over on the left-hand side, we see Donna's inbox, but we also see the public folder structure here. If we expand this out, we see all public folders, and then we can see the various public folders that she can access: London, Miami, Trinidad. Now, it's interesting because here, if we look at these different ones, like London, we can right-click, and she is the owner, so she can actually rename the folder, copy the folder. She can create new folders. If we go to Miami, notice she doesn't have that level of permission over Miami or Trinidad. But under London, as the owner, she has much more in terms of abilities over that folder than the others. Now, if we go into Properties, we can see here that if we go to Permissions, that Donna is listed as the owner, and that gives her all of the permissions. She can add additional individuals to this folder. She can create subfolders and handle the permissions for those subfolders as well. So there's a lot that can be done from within the public folder itself once a person is the owner of it. And so again, as administrators, it's encouraged that you find individuals that you can trust in different departments, or in this case, different locations, and then delegate that responsibility off to them. Give them owner capabilities or one of these other structures within the permission levels, or create a customized level so that you feel comfortable handing over to others the management over pieces of that public folder structure. So we hope you found that informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future lesson.